Hello and welcome back to the Radio Caroline YouTube channel where you're joined by me, Josh Holmes-Bright. And today we've got another episode of the Caroline Legends Interviews series, and we're joined by none other than the world-renowned hypnotist, the best-selling author of many self-help books, and the beloved TV personality, of course, as well, the former Radio Caroline DJ. Hopefully I've sold you enough there. It's Paul McKenna, of course. Hi, Paul. How you doing?
Hello, Josh. Doing great. Thanks. Lovely to be talking to you today.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to have you here. So we met on the Ross Revenge in, I think, September last year. And that was the first time I met you. And I would have been at your Christmas party as well last year, but there were train strikes that day. So I apologize. I couldn't get down, but it's nice to have you here and nice to be able to chat to you properly again. And we're going to sort of go through your career right from when you started at Caroline through the years. You've done lots of stuff, as I just mentioned there. But I always like to start these interviews with your earliest musical memory, if you can remember all the way back to sort of that first thing that sparked your interest in music. Can you remember that far back?
I can, yeah. I mean, I remember as a young child, early 60s, hearing the radio when Radio 1 started in the later 60s. I can remember hearing Tony Blackburn and David Hamilton, but also I remember being on the beach, and I can't remember quite where it was. Maybe it was Felixstowe, and hearing Radio Caroline. We were sitting there on the beach, and it came on the radio, and it was fascinating. I thought, wow, this is a very different sound. But my interest in radio really began in the 70s, because somebody gave me it was a double album which had the history of the pirate radio station. It had recordings of Radio London, Caroline, Radio England, all of them, RNI, and explained to me that it was really a sort of a freedom of speech movement, that there'd been this revolution back in the 60s. You know, there was only an hour of pop music a week allowed on the BBC, and people had started offshore radio stations, but this extraordinary Irishman, Ronan O'Reilly, this very dynamic, amazing, very colourful character, he'd started Radio Caroline, which was the game changer. And of course, other stations then followed. Yeah. And then they got shut down because the Wilson government, dreadful man, Harold Wilson, and that other dreadful man, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, decided to shut them down, using this sort of nonsense, saying they were interfering with emergency services, weren't even on the same wavelength. And really, it was all just about control. And I saw this as a fascinating kind of movement that had taken place, because it was also involved with youth culture, because in the 1960s, finally post-war rationing is finished, and young people have got money, there's free love, there's drugs, there's fashion, there's all sorts of an explosion of this kind of amazing youth culture, the soundtrack to which was provided by the pirate radio stations. So where were you going to hear the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, etc., or the Who, or these great bands that really broke out in the 60s? You could get them just about Radio Luxembourg in the evening, or that hour of pop music a week the BBC allowed. So this was a game changer. This is like I suppose comparable in many ways to sort of how the internet has revolutionized a culture. We can all talk to ourselves and communicate. We can all talk to each other. We can communicate and create art and conversation and debate and all sorts of extraordinary things now through social media. It's a new form of democracy, arguably. And in a sense, pirate radio was too. It was a new form of democracy. It wasn't just the music also. It was the actual style of the way the DJs broadcast. Because you've got to remember, the BBC, which in many ways is a fine institution, but it's an institution. And, people there would be reading the news with a bow tie on, and everything was scripted, all control, and suddenly you had people just saying what they wanted. Look, I remember Kenny Everett telling me, he said he couldn't believe it. People go, oh, look, I've just seen a bird land on the mast, and right now we're here in the North Sea and we're having fun, and guess what, somebody said to me earlier, and it had this extraordinarily conversational and happy sort of feel about it. Plus, they were playing music that nobody else was. So when I heard this album, I suddenly went, right, I'm intrigued by this. And Capital Radio hadn't long started. So I started listening to that, and again, its sound was unique and new. It was different to Radio 1. Radio 1 was this sort of shiny, very polished station. Capital Radio was much more, in a sense, laid back. The DJs had a different way of speaking. They weren't all upbeat, that sort of thing. They were much more conversationally communicative. And my favorite DJ was Kenny Everett. And so I kind of became obsessed with Capital Radio, and I just loved Kenny Everett. I thought he was the best thing I'd ever heard.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, some great names you mentioned there. In terms of the music, though, that was played, what were there any bands in particular that stood out to you, or artists? Of course, you mentioned the Beatles and the Stones and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me growing up, it was the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, Genesis. You know, I like sort of progressive rock. And then what happened was we had a revolution with punk music in the late 70s, which was fantastic. You know, it was 2 years of sort of angry music, but you had bands like the Stranglers, you know, and all kinds of, and the Pretenders, all these like great, you know, different sounding bands, followed by glamour disco, which I loved, Chic, Shalimar, I'm trying to think of all the other sort of the bands of that time, you know, which had this very glossy, glamorous, you know, opulent sort of sound, you know. So musically, it was a very rich era. I mean, personally, I think if you look at 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, were perhaps for me the best era of music. I'm not saying there isn't good music around now, but for me, the sheer creativity and the diversity in sound was absolutely amazing. And, you know, that was one of the things, really, I suppose, we led the world for a while, and still do to some extent, in music. You know, you could argue that Americans led the world in film, but, you know, we led the world. If you think about all the really great bands, you know, the majority of them were English or English influenced.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree with you there. And some of the names you mentioned, I think we hear them a fair bit. The Beatles, the Stones, and Genesis for good reason, I think. So very wise choices there. And you mentioned listening to Caroline through the 70s. When was it that you got involved with Radio Caroline? Was this your first station as well that you DJ'd at?
No, I'd so back in the late 70s, I worked in Topshop. I was I walked in one day. I went to hospital radio, and they said, "You're too young, kid. You know, off you go." And what I did was I'd actually, sorry, how it actually started was I thought I was going to be an artist, a graphic designer or something. And there was a Capital Radio had a show on a Sunday afternoon, a magazine show, one of the competitions involving drawing something, but they also had a young DJ spot where they'd let a young guy, you know, play through records. And I put just a note attached to my drawing, which I thought was going to win, saying, "Oh, I wouldn't mind having a young DJ slot." And I get home from school, and David Briggs, who was later to become my boss, he's on the phone, and he said, "Yeah, we'd really like you to do this." And he said, "Can you get in? Can you get here tonight?" And my dad actually was in charge of the maintenance for the Euston Tower, where Capital Radio were located. So Dad drove me up to Capital Radio, and I walked up that staircase, and I fell in love with it. I thought, oh my God, the radio station was relatively new. This would have been 1977. And you know, it was all sort of, you know, it was big and opulent and amazing. And, you know, I went into one of the studios, and because all the studios were in a hub around a central master control, you could look through and see Roger Scott there. I saw Dave Cash over there. They sat me in a booth, said, "Get an idea about what you want to say. Light comes on, you speak, and we'll play the records in," you know. And so I said, "Hi, I'm Paul McKenna. I'm your young DJ for the week. Here's Donna Summer," you know, something like that. And I came out, and David Briggs, Maggie Norton went, "You're really quite natural at this, aren't you?" And I said, "Really? I don't know. He said, no, no. And I got encouragement because I went into Topshop in Oxford Circus, where there was a great DJ called Steve Collins. And in the 1970s, the training ground for DJs, well, apart from the 60s was pirate radio station, the 70s was UBN, United Biscuits Network, where they had basically a station that went to the factories where people were making biscuits. But it's also where, you know, half the Capital Radio DJs trained as well. And Topshop became that in the 80s. So the end of the 70s, I met Steve. He let me practice and then put me on the air one day. And I made a cassette myself. And I used to go down to Capital Radio and wait outside for Kenny Everett. And when he came out, I'd ask him questions. And bless him, he'd sit and he'd answer them. And, you know, he was always very encouraging. And, you know, one day I gave him a tape. I said, "Could you tell me what you think?" And the next week he said, "Yeah, I listened to your tape." I said, "What do you think?" He goes, "You should be a DJ." And that was it. I felt like I'd been anointed, right?
Yeah,
And
of course.
it was great. I mean, little did I know that 10 years later I would be at Capital Radio, and I would take over. I took over the show that Kenny used to do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no pressure. I
Yeah.
mean,
I'm sure he was happy with that, wasn't he?
well, yeah. I mean, the thing was that what happened was Capital in the 80s split the AM and FM, and they became two services. So FM played contemporary hit music and AM played oldies. And the DJs that were associated with, the eras of the 60s and 70s became, associated with that music. So they moved over to the gold format on AM. And us young whippersnappers, we stayed on FM. But as Roger Scott said, his opening link on his first day on Capitol Gold, he said, you've heard the boys with the noise. Now here's the men with the music. He started his first record.
That's good. I like that. Very good. So in the end, the apprentice became the master, really, you could say. You took over from the guy who
I don't know if I became the
job.
master, but I mean, basically, it was really daunting because I did a daft thing. I'd never been nervous broadcasting. What I did is I'd worked in pirate radio, so I built a bit of experience. I worked on a couple of land-based pirates. I worked at a station called Sovereign, which was an oldie station started by my friend Crispin St. John. And Crispian, proper character, he was Caroline Oren, and he would talk like this. He had this great voice, and he used to call everyone Shag. And he rang me up. He goes, "Hello, Shag. I've just started a pirate station. Want to come and play some tunes?" And so we were it was in a loft in a house in southwest London with a disco unit to begin with. Suddenly, the station became really popular, so they built a whole proper studio, and South London generally was really populated with pirate radio stations in those days. Some playing soul music. There was Skyline, there was Horizon, and then there was Radio Jackie, Radio Jackie were really the hardcore. They were like the Viet Cong of pirates. I mean, nothing could stop Jackie. They were unbeatable. They started out in the 70s, running across fields with the transmitter in a biscuit tin, being chased by what was in the GPO. They were very ideologically driven, and they were great guys. I mean, and so I did a stint for a while at Jackie, and Caroline had the original ship had sunk, sadly, and they were off the air. But Ronan managed to get. It's an extraordinary achievement. He managed to get the funding and everything, built, arguably it's the greatest pirate radio ship of all time, the Ross Revenge. He got it fitted out. And in 1983, it came back. And several of my friends were the first people to appear on Caroline. One of them was Peter Quinn. And Peter... he said, I love Peter. He's a fantastic broadcaster. And I said to Peter, it sounds fantastic. Do you think you can help me? He goes, "Oh, yes, I think I can help you, Paul." So he made an introduction. It's not like, you can just ring up and go, "I'd like to work on Radio Caroline." It was clandestine, illegal for a British citizen to work on it, which was part of the appeal, So I had to go to Covent Garden and meet Ronan. And this shop, what it did was the front it was a laminating shop. And I met Mike and a whole bunch of other people. And Ronan would have the conversation with you to find out really if you were a Caroline person. Right? That's what I deduced from it. And he goes, "What type of music do you like? What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And you talk about music, politics, art, stuff. I mean, he was wonderful. Ronan was like a guru, right?
Yeah.
He just had his presence. And he would come out with things, he'd tell you a story about something, it could be, to do with the Vietnam War, or it could be a story about when he was hanging out with the Beatles, or about a movie he'd made or something. And he was this almost mythical character. And I thought, this is the greatest adventure I've ever had in my life. And he goes, "Oh, Paul, I think we're going out to the ship now." And so I told my parents that I said, "I'm going to work on a pirate radio station in the North Sea." And they were, "What?" I said, "Trust me, it's going to be great. It's okay." No one ever broke even as much as a fingernail, is what Ronan told me. I mean, it was safe, And they said, "Please let us know you're all right." I said, "I'll play this record once a show. It was The Cars, Who's Going to Drive You Home. It was the big hit at the time.
Great track.
And great. And so that's how I let them know all was well. So we met at a train station. Then we made our way down to Harwich. Then we sneaked onto this little fishing boat. I mean, it's all like, clandestine, great fun, and it took ages to get hours to get out to the boat, because it was 18 miles off the coast. And we passed the mast of the Mi Amigo on the way. And I saw this, on the horizon. And funnily enough, I've had this conversation with a number of people, with Roger Day. I mean, even Gavin McCoy said we had lunch with him. He goes, the moment when you see the ship, right? We check whatever it's shipping, and the goosebumps and the wowness of it.
Yeah.
And it had this absolutely awesome mast, biggest in the world at the time. And parked next to it was the communicator, the laser ship.
Of course,
And, we were part of the revolution. It was so cool. And I got on board, and I met Johnny Lewis, wonderful guy. I love Johnny. He's a great DJ and a really great guy.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And Johnny is like pure Caroline. If you sliced him in half, not what you want to, you'd see Caroline like a stick of rock there. And my friend Michael Barrington, the engineer, he'd been the engineer at Jackie and Sovereign. Michael was on board with Pete Chicago. There was a bunch of other people. Grant Benson and my old friend Crispin St. John was there, using the name Jay Jackson. And so I had the tour of the ship, and it was just mind blowing. I went, I can't believe it. And then after a little while, the generator packed up and all the lights went out, and we all fumbled around in the dark, and we had to go down into the bowels of the ship. Big, and for anyone who hasn't been on board, it's not like going on a P&O cruise. It's things smell of diesel. It's like being in the merchant navy a bit. It's not a luxury boat. However, as pirate radio stations go, it's pretty good. And
it's authentic.
It's authentic, yeah. So, and I looked outside and I could see all these lights moving, other ships, and I thought, oh, hang on, we can see them, but they can't see us. And I had a little moment of, crikey, what have I done? And that soon passed. And the sense of camaraderie was great. Everybody was, there were really interesting characters. Tom Anderson was there as well. I'm trying to think who else. Who was with Alton Andrews was on the ship. And so it was a really interesting, eclectic mix of people. The neat thing is you could play whatever you wanted. And also, and I'll tell you, this was a really interesting thing, because in those days, Radio 1, the DJ would play a record, start, speak, and then play another record. The Nova had been an absolutely amazing success. And of course, that clutter-free format that had worked so well for Nova, Caroline was to some extent emulating, because Andy Archer was one of the, he'd been the program director of Nova, and he was the first on Caroline, on the new Caroline, and so had brought that ethos. So we were encouraged to, play music, not try and be big personalities like some of the other stations were doing. Let the music speak. And so I mean, I would obviously play the sort of things you would expect, some progressive rock and a bit of chart music, but sometimes I'd go well left field. And I remember one day playing Stairway to Heaven, Birdland by Weather Report, and then Ella Fitzgerald, I Get a Kick Out of You. I slammed on the end of it. And I thought at the time, where in the world would you hear those three records in a row?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the music was really important. Plus, also there was something called loving awareness that Ronan talked to you about, right? Mm-hmm. And you hear the DJs on the ship saying, "With love and good music, live from the North Sea, this is Radio Caroline." And there was little drop-ins that went, "Loving awareness is free. It's free, 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 free," like this, in that beautiful Tony Allen voice. And I said to Ronan, what do you think? I know people talk on the air about loving awareness. Can you tell me what it is? He goes, "What do you think it is, Paul?" And I said, well, I imagine it's sending out a good vibe. It's peace. It's being positive. It's sending love out. And he goes, "Then that's what it is." I went, "Oh, so it's a non-dog kind of religion in a sense. It's a kind of it's a spiritual sort of thing, and again, I think this added to the beauty and the magic of Caroline. This whole sort of idea that because again, the feeling on board wasn't that we were all there just to play records, that we really believed in the ethos of Caroline, which was about freedom of speech, positive change to the world, disruption, revolution, etc. In a very positive way. And so it was music, it was the way you communicated, and you knew the moment you opened the mic, right? This was possibly the biggest commercial radio station in Europe. I mean, remember, it wasn't just hitting the UK, it was all over, not just Western Europe, Eastern Europe. And of course, there's no pop music there in what were communist countries at the time. It was all just propaganda. And, so we got a ton of mail. I mean, for the internet, so you get real physical mail in bags of it, right? And a lot of it would be from countries in the Eastern Bloc, saying, we're having a party, we're putting Caroline on tonight, and it was that was again one of the things that was just very extraordinary.
Yeah, incredible. It's a bit of a jump, a bit of a leap, I know, but do you reckon this whole sort of loving awareness, the peace, and this kind of message that Caroline was sending out at the time, a bit of a leap, I know, but do you think that influenced in any way your later projects with the whole, taking care of the mind? You recently done the book on freedom from anxiety, that kind of thing. Do you reckon there was any sort of influence there?
I think it's a very good question, actually. I think it planted a seed. I mean, I was always interested in things like yoga and meditation, and I'd read books about, say, Zen Buddhism. So I had a foundation there of interest. So I practiced. I used to do meditation, yoga, etc., and read about Buddhism. And so loving awareness fitted in quite nicely with the idea that we just send out good vibes, which is essentially what I was saying to Ronan. When you think about it, when you listen to music or someone speaking to you, you're being bathed in sound waves, right? And if they're nice sound waves and the intent of the person is something good, then it's likely to make you feel good. And so, I think at the very sort of the basis of the Caroline ethos was, because Ronan used to say, he'd come out with these things, he'd go, Caroline can be anywhere, right? And the idea, almost like Caroline is an ontology, it's a state of being, it's not just about music. And I think that was something implicit in the way we communicated. And certainly we were all massive anoraks, right? I mean, we'd literally of an evening, if we weren't watching, we had one TV in the mess room, and one night it might be a porn movie, or another night it might be a anorak movie, one of these sort of stories of this Caroline in the 60s or something, and everyone on board was in love with Radio Caroline, with radio, and people like Crispian had been there in the sort of the 60s and the 70s. And then all those younger whippersnappers were there in the early 80s. I was 20 years old at the time, so I'm a kid.
Oh, wow. Yeah, more or less. Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't know how to put it into words. Obviously, there is that influence there from the love and awareness, as you say. It's, I mean, it's very different. Obviously, you've written the books on self-help and all that, and you've done recently, you're doing a tour, I saw. Is there any difference from doing it on the radio, where of course you're just in a room by yourself? I think it might be Ray Clark or someone who describes radio. If you described it to someone, it's pretty crazy. You're sitting in a room playing music and talking to yourself, basically. That's more or less what this job is. Is there any difference from putting that into words in a book or talking in front of people, doing these speeches that you do, albeit on a different subject? Is there much of a difference there in those kind of areas?
Well, it's a good question. I never think when I'm sitting in a radio studio, I'm talking to myself. And I think, I forget who it was, but somebody put a transistor radio on the desk, right? And they said, imagine when you speak, you're coming out of that little box, and people in their house, their car, their factory are listening to you. Just imagine you're connecting with all these people. And that's so I never thought I've never been blasé about opening a mic and speaking. I'm think before I open the mic, get an idea, even if it's an abstract idea about what it is I want to say, and I want to communicate something. So, it could be a simple thing, it could be a station ident, good afternoon, it's in Caroline, or it can be, well, great thing there about Pink Floyd, blah, blah, blah. It could be a story or anything. Now, the difference between being a DJ is generally the idea is to elevate people's mood, is to make them feel good. Or, if it's an easy listening station, it's to make them feel reassured and calm and, peaceful, etc. That's generally what I find music radio is about. It's feel good. And what I do is when I'm communicating, so I'm walking out to do a motivational event, it's in the realm of feel good. But I'm, instead of playing records, I'm using my psychological techniques to shift people out of negative thinking and behaviors and into positive ones. I'm teaching them how they can run their own mind. So there's more education than entertainment, but it's a form of edutainment, if you like. Whereas I see radio as purely music radio is purely educational. As entertainment. See, it's purely entertainment. The educational side of radio might be news, stuff like that. But you pick up the odd fact along the way, listening to a music show, you learn something, about a rock star or something, because it gets said in the commentary by the DJ. But it's interesting. When I decided to become a hypnotist, because I've been used to talking like this as a DJ, right? Open the mic and you've got confidence and a smile. A hypnotist is more like you're talking to somebody very gently, like a bedtime story. And so instead of the intonations going up, the intonations are going down. And you want your speech to be calming, reassuring, speak slowly. Whereas as a DJ, you've got that slight, kind of happy swagger.
Yeah, the kick.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Now, I won't put you on the spot and say which one do you prefer, because, of course, you much prefer radio, Caroline. I won't put words into your mouth, but, of course, I'm sure it's a difficult choice. But I do hope that we'll see you back out on the ship very, very soon. Do you have any plans of coming back out?
I will be on the ship this September.
Brilliant.
I'm coming back. Johnny's going to be there too. I'm hoping Grant will come. It's because obviously I love going to the ship. And the romance of it. I love being on the air because apart from a few years ago when I started doing the Caroline North weekends, I hadn't done it for 30 years. And so it was, So it was, and also I'd never used the modern equipment. I'd never used the playout system when I left. There were records and carts and CDs had just come in, right? So, I still can't get my head around that playout system anyway. For people like you, it's natural. You sit down and do it. So that's, what I really have to think. And it's a bit terrifying, but I also love the excitement of it. But it's also, hanging out with everybody, the endless racking, the endless anaracking, talking about transmitters, jingles, pirate ships, other DJs, and I suppose having an appreciation for what was it was an era, a very different era. The world was a very different place, and and nowadays radio is very specialized format. There's lots and lots of stations. There were hardly any back in the 1970s and 80s. And the way people listen to the radio is different. The old days you'd listen for what the DJ said because, whereas now it's treated more like wallpaper. It's on in the background. People have so many other interests now. There was no internet, there was no social media or anything like that. And so, so we're really sort of celebrating a different era. It's almost in a sense, the Caroline ship is like a floating museum. So the original studio is there exactly as it was in the 1980s, 1984, in fact, when I was there. And we've added a new studio, which has got more kit on it. So sorry.
That's okay.
Let me start again. Yeah, the original studio is there as it was in 1984. It's exactly the same. The record library is the same. We've added a new studio using modern equipment. Oh, the thing that has changed is the galley. And that's probably a good thing because the galley, the kitchen was, when I was there, I mean, I'm sure some WMDs got manufactured in that
Right.
cabin. Yeah, there was some rum food got made, whereas we got on newer kitchen. But apart from that, the ship is exactly the same as it was in the 80s. So for me, going back after 35 something years, maybe more than that, it was amazing. It was a bit overwhelming, a bit eerie, because I stepped on the boat and it was like nothing had changed. My cabin was exactly the same, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, it is a beautiful ship, and it's got so much history. And of course, you know, these trips that take place, you get a tender, it takes 20 minutes to get out. It's in the River Blackwater, and you meet the DJs, you do the tour, hear the history. I mean, it really is fantastic. People I know I didn't think would be that interested, you know, phoned me up and said, "Do you want this? I do on the Radio Caroline." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you can come out if you want, take one of the trips." And they absolutely love it. You know, it's well worth doing. So if you're watching this and you're fascinated by Caroline, I strongly recommend taking the trip one weekend.
Yeah, it is magical. I've been doing it for just over a year, I think, a year and a few months. I've been involved with Caroline, and every time, even for someone like me, you know, going out there each time, as you say, approaching the ship, there's something magical. I think nowadays it's a bit different. Everyone pulls out their phone to get a photo instead,
Yeah,
no matter how
exactly.
many times you've been out there. But yeah, there is something special about it. You're right. Yeah, which is fantastic. I didn't realize that it was I knew it was very similar to what it was. I didn't realize it was pretty much exactly the same as
Pretty
what it
much
was.
exactly the same. I mean, you know, you know, the mess room is identical, nothing's changed there, and the cabins, and there's a couple of little bits, but you know, it looks the same, it smells the same, it feels the same. I mean, you know, it's in a calm estuary now rather than the North Sea,
Yeah.
which was you know, it was great, but you looked around, you could see the communicator and ships going past, but apart from that, you're right in the middle of the North Sea, and it felt great because you're in this, you know, this huge expanse. And I do like first thing in the morning looking out and seeing the ocean. It's really wonderful.
It's lovely, yeah, it really is. And now, that kind of gives us a nice link into the next bit, actually, with the whole peacefulness of the river. Obviously, you're renowned now for your relaxation techniques and everything like that, and you're fresh off a tour a couple of weeks ago. I think I saw the last post of that. So I think it would be silly if I didn't ask if there's a sort of top relaxation tip, because obviously now I have to work with computers rather than turntables on the radio, so that gets very stressful, as we figured out a month or two ago when things start to go wrong. So have you got a sort of top relaxation technique or anything along those lines?
You know, there is one, Josh. This is used by all 4 divisions of the American military. And this technique is really simple. It takes less than a minute to do. So if people are feeling stressed or anxious or overwhelmed, right? First thing you do is you put your hand on your heart. Now that then draws your attention to your heart, which is really the second brain, right? So it begins to reduce cortisol. And when people are stressed, they are all tight like that, they don't breathe properly. But also, when you force a deep breath in and a deep breath out, it changes your neurology and physiology. So you do this, you go hand on heart, then you go, and you hold it, and then you gently let it go. And then you breathe in again, and you gently let it go. And then you take a third deep breath in, and as you let it go, you remember a time that you felt good. Maybe you'd achieved something, fallen in love, or you just relaxing with friends. And you return to that time like you're back there again now. And you see what you saw, and you hear what you heard, and you feel the good feelings again. And usually in less than a minute, you go from feeling overwhelmed or stressed into a much calmer, more resilient place. So there's a quickie that anyone could do, really getting to your hand on your heart, 3 slow, deep breaths, and remember a good time like you're back there again.
That's brilliant. You can't see my hand on my chest on the camera here, but I was doing that as you said it, and I feel a lot more relaxed. I could go to sleep now. I might end the interview here if that's all right. No, that's a very good tip. So I was saying there, of course, you had the tour. You were on the road recently, and what's that like? Because I mean, when you say on the road to people, you think of those great rock bands. You know, we spoke about many earlier. What's it like being on the road doing a tour like yours?
Well, it's not like being in a rock group. Years ago, when I toured a comedy hypnotism show, I'd be doing 200 shows a year, every night somewhere up and down the country. I'm about to be 60, so I take it a little easier now. So what I tend to do is we go play like 8 major cities: London, Birmingham, Manchester, Edinburgh, Dublin, Belfast, Bristol, something like that. We'll play around the country. And what I do is these days is I do a 90 minutes. It's like a coaching session. So I walk out and I'm talking away and I'll go, "Who's frightened of public speaking?" And when the hands go up, I go, "Come and join me, somebody." And they come on the stage nervous. And within a couple of minutes, their fear's gone and they can talk to the audience without fear. And I'll say, "You see what we just did there? Let's do that, everybody, if you want to, in the audience." And I say, "Pick something that overwhelms you or frightens you," and bam, it goes. And so really what it is it's not a lecture, it's a dynamic experience. It's everything I would do with you if I was sat here with you, but there's just 500 other people present. And I make some of it lighthearted, but it's all about, self-improvement. So the last one I did was about confidence. The tour I did before that was positivity. The tour I did before that was the 3 things that will change your destiny today. And they're usually aspirational things. And then at the end, I do a selfie with everyone. That's the real work. So I stay for about an hour and, pose with everybody and do the pictures, meet people. Because, I think that's one of the things that, again, is different today, is that people share lots more information on their phone, what they're eating, who they're with, what they're doing, and they like to do that. It's nice, it's better than getting a postcard. And so, so I talk to people because many of them say, "Oh, I read one of your books years ago and it helped me in this way or that." And so it's nice for me to get to meet people. And I do that at the beginning of the year. I'm going to do it again next year. In fact, it's also an excuse for me to go to places where I have friends, like, say, Dublin, and drink some Guinness, eat some fantastic food, socialize with some of my friends, some of them radio friends, and then I go to another city, and and again, once I see some people I like, I work for 90 minutes. It's actually 2.5 hours, really, and that's about enough. That's all I want to do. And sometimes I do 2 or 3 nights in a row, but mostly what I tend to do is I give myself recovery time these days, so I don't work quite as hard as I used to. And what I do is I build in time to relax and not have to work before I then work again. Whereas I used to I treated life like a marathon, and I just go at it until I burned out. Now I treat it as a series of sprints, cover in between.
Absolutely, it's definitely important to do that. I mean, especially if you could, end up reading one of your own books to sort of try and recover. You don't want to overwork yourself to that extent. But no, that's definitely the right way to do it. I think you never want to do too much, but also want to fit everything in, which is that's great. And now another venture you've taken over the last couple of years, you have the Positivity podcast as well. And I thought it would be interesting because you've got some big names on the list. I had a scroll through for some of the older ones as well that I might have forgotten. Some huge names on the podcast. I thought it might be interesting to list off a few, see if you can remember some sort of story about them, maybe about their sort of positivity or their mindfulness or anything you've got, really, just because there are some icons here. So the first one I've got, I mean, this is huge in itself and fits in with this Caroline conversation we've been having, the frontman of The Who, the 60s legend that is Roger Daltrey. What about him? What dirt have you got on Roger Daltrey?
Well, Roger's an old mate of mine, and and I got to say, The Who is probably one of the best live bands I've ever seen. Might be the best live band, actually. I mean, there's this energy of it. He's got one of the best voices. Roger's a really good bloke. He's lovely. He does so much charity work. He's a wonderful person, and I can tell you, because he tells everybody, there's no secrets in the public domain. When he first came to see me years ago, he wanted to make some changes, and he wanted. What he wanted to do is, when he walks on stage, to be in a peak state of performance. So he uses my confidence trance. He's a very confident person, very confident actually, but he wants to be in the zone when he walks on the stage, when he's performing at the Super Bowl for 1 billion people, And I started out by, I said, right. Okay, now can I just ask you some Keith Moon stories? He goes, yeah, ask anything you want. And we struck up this friendship. And so when I began this podcast, I rang up, some of my famous friends, because the idea was to talk to household names, but instead of interview them like a journalist, interview them from a psychological point of view and find out their sort of positive mindset, what works for them, how they overcome adversity, what's their self-care, what makes them happy, and then, I throw in the odd, the humorous question like, have you ever been starstruck? I mean, everyone's got a hilarious story to do with that. Yeah. But so that's kind of what happened. When I was living in America, I did a show for the channel Hulu, and the idea was to interview people as a psychologist. So I interviewed people like Simon Cowell and Ryan Seacrest or Lulu or Roger Moore, also a very eclectic mix of people. Yeah, and I did a couple of seasons of that, and then I returned to live here a few years ago, back in the UK, and friend of mine who works for Global, he said, we've had this idea, that show you did in America, would you like to do a podcast? Because podcast is the new genre. It's taking over. It's going to be huge. And I didn't know that much about it. But we sat down. I went, I would really love to do this. So the chap who produces it, it's one of my oldest friends. I've known him since I was about 15. And what happens is we get offered different people to participate, and it's really a hobby for me. It's not so much a work or commercial venture, but it's something where I get to meet people who I wouldn't ordinarily. So these might be actors, chefs. You get an astronaut I interviewed the other day, Chris Hadfield. But then you'll get some icon, and so
it looks like it's okay.
There you go.
Like I said earlier, technology does its own thing.
Don't worry. So I get to interview all kinds of people from different walks of life, the arts, sports, business, etc., and ask them interesting questions. And we have a conversation. Some people have said it sounds like therapy at times. I wouldn't say it's quite that, but it's just, for me, it's fascinating, and I find people fascinating. And my wife said to me, what if you interview someone who's not interesting? I went, everyone is interesting, or I somehow am able to find interesting things in the conversation that I have with them.
Of course. Now, another certainly interesting, I mean, you mentioned some of the people there who you can quite put a name on. Obviously, there's the musicians, but people who you might not have a label for what they do. I think this next person fits perfectly into that. Definitely an interesting character as well would be Bear Grylls. I was wondering if there's any sort of relaxation techniques or something he does.
Well, Bear's really brilliant, right? He's this incredibly motivated, dynamic. He's a really good bloke, by the way, as well. I mean, I don't know him that well, but he's this very, very good guy, and he's a SAS soldier. He's a real man, right? But you pick up gems from everybody, and one of his motivation strategies was that. I said, how do you keep yourself going? Because he was telling me about some of the things he was doing, when he was in the army, what it was like. And I thought, how do you keep yourself going? He goes, the pain of giving up and the shame of it and the having to live with it is worse than the pain of having to continue. So basically, I think, I ain't giving up. I'm just going to continue. I'm just going to keep going. That's one of the ways he motivates himself, And he's, again, somebody with a genuine love of life, and he's a good bloke. He's the guy you see on TV is exactly who he is.
That's really good. I like that. The whole carrying on rather than giving up as well. Certainly a very good thing. I think most people probably would like to take on. I know it's easier said than done, but yeah, definitely a good piece of advice there. Another name I've got, not along the music line, when you're quite famously on Top Gear, you done some work with him, but Richard Hammond as well. I thought there might be something interesting there because he's, I mean, I wouldn't say he's known for crashing and having all these incidents, but it's certainly well known that he does have them. So what about Richard Hammond?
Richard, he's a lovely guy, and lots of people have seen the clip of where I hypnotized him I hypnotized him on Top Gear. Yeah. And he genuinely was hypnotized. And the idea was that I would hypnotize him so he would forget how to drive a car, right? And so he's standing, he goes, so let's test drive the new Alfa Romeo. And he gets in, and I sit next to him, and he goes, and I go, what's that thing in the middle there? He goes, we look at the steering wheel. He goes, that's the big control. I said, well, how do you drive the car? He says, might be this. And he's pushing the cigarette lighter, and also, and Jeremy Clarkson, he's crying with laughter, right? And so is James Hammond, and Anyway, it's a hilarious piece. It's one of those things that people, even though it's about 20 years ago I did this, because it's on the internet, people still come up to me, even like in America or all over the world. They go, "You're the Top Gear hypnotist guy, right?" Right? I go, "Yeah, that's right." Yeah. And bless him, he was a good sport. And I said to him afterwards, what was it like when he goes, "I really just didn't know how to start the car. It was confusing, like the coffee machine at work."
Right. Yeah.
It was fascinating. So Richard's a good guy too. I mean, all the people I interview are fascinating. They're all really interesting.
Of course, yeah, that's a great story as well. Back along the music line for the last one as well. I mean, when you've got a Sir in the name, it's a big one. But Sir Bob Geldof, I mean, what have you got on him? I think that'd be always an interesting thing.
Again, I don't know Bob that well. I mean, I've met him a number of times, but there's a very big-hearted man, a man full of compassion and a very dynamic character. I remember Nick Mason from Pink Floyd saying, because no, they had no idea, they had no intention to get back together as a band. They'd been the big fallout. And I said, so how did that happen? He said, "Have you tried saying no to Bob Geldof?" I know what you mean. But he is this incredibly dynamic sort of force of nature. He's changed the world. When you think about not just what Live Aid and Live 8 did in terms of raise money, but it was the compassion that they suddenly got people feeling for fellow human beings. And that, I think, was the single greatest achievement. And when I met him, we'd spoken on the phone once, and I said, he was at a function, and I said, "Oh, hi, Bob, it's, oh, God, nice to meet you." And I said, I think what you did was amazing. But did we really? I said, no, forget the money. I think the compassion element was, and he goes, "That's a great thing." And he hugged me like this. And I think of Bob as a really wonderful human being, somebody who's had big challenges in his life, as we know, but he's a really great guy, and he's created this phenomenal legacy and change in the way that people think, through the charity concerts that he put on.
Yeah, certainly has. Well, 4 great stories there, 4 big name drops as well. I wanted to build you up again as we sort of draw to an end. But thank you very much for doing this. We do appreciate it on the YouTube channel as well, helping us get into the 21st century. But yeah, you said you'd be out in September on the ship. I believe I'll be there that weekend too.
Brilliant. So, okay, well, let's do a bit of anoracking, because
absolutely.
That's part of the reason I love Caroline. It's the only bit of radio I do now is once a year is going to come out to the ship, see some of my old friends, and play some records and talk about those anorak things that are great fun.
Of course. Yeah, brilliant. Well, I look forward to seeing you out there. Thanks again for doing this. Really do appreciate that. So Paul McKenna, everyone. Thank you very much.